for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say. I'm an interaction designer at Bloomberg. I've been at Bloomberg now for about 2.5 years. And for the 2.5 years that I've been here, my focus has mostly been on mobile interaction design. But most recently, I made a move over to working on more internal tools for desktop for our employees here at Bloomberg. I focus on how we manage outages and how the workflows, how we support the workflows digitally when those outages occur here within Bloomberg. So it's been a little bit of a switch for me, but the focus of my presentation is really about Agile, and that's another thing that I've done here at Bloomberg is talks to our UX team and helped our UX team learn how we best fit into the Agile or the Scrum framework. So the flavor of Agile that we practice here is Scrum. But before I talk through my own case study, I wanted to give you a bit more history on my relationship with Agile, with Lean, how I reached the point where I am today. So I'm going to go back about 5 years ago. Before 5 years ago, obviously in 2008, there was this big splash that everybody knows about, I'm sure, called the Lean Startup Movement. And a few years later, that inspired the Lean UX movement, or the Lean UX book and information on Lean UX and methodologies around that. I didn't really know much about that 5 years ago, but actually now it's 6 years ago when I think about it. But my boss offered to send me to a Lean UX immersion for a weekend here in New York City when I first arrived here. So I thought, well, that'd be interesting. Maybe there's got to be better ways of working than we're working now. So I went, and it was very inspiring to me. It was taught by, you probably all know Jeff Seiden. You probably all heard of him, the author of the Lean UX book, the co-author. Also a woman named Lane Haley, who's another big sort of founding member of the Lean UX movement. And it really inspired me, to think this way of doing work would really, I thought, revolutionize the way we do work in UX in this large financial firm that I worked for at the time. It wasn't Bloomberg, but it was another company. So I continued to learn about it. I continued to attend meetings in New York City, different meetups, conferences. We had the first Lean UX conference here in New York City about that time, and I attended that. And then I sort of became this enterprise advocate for Lean UX. At the time, not many enterprises were practicing Lean UX because there were some things that we felt didn't quite apply to us. For example, it was hard for us to be co-located. There were various reasons. We didn't necessarily have the access to users that maybe a startup would have. So I became this sort of enterprise advocate for Lean UX, and I thought about ways that Lean UX still could be applied within an enterprise. And in so doing, I within the company that I worked for, I began educating our UX team on what Lean UX is and why it's something that is worth looking into. I also worked with other interested parties within the company, and kind of gave just basically anybody who would listen to me, I would tell them about Lean UX. And I even went up to the executives and was able to present the ideas of Lean UX to them. I hosted training classes, lunch and learn. So whatever kind of teaching that I could do, I would just do it on my own. I would find ways to spread this knowledge and get people sort of on board with what I was doing. And then I thought, well, nothing's going to happen unless we start applying this methodology. And I sold the idea of doing a 1-week experiment with the thinking that if we did this 1-week experiment, well, we would show how great this process was, and we would be able to start doing it throughout the entire company. I thought it would really be a good way of demonstrating that, and I was allowed to do that. I was given the opportunity to do this 1-week experiment. So we picked a thorny problem. We gathered a crack team in New York. This crack team included a product manager, engineers, user experience designer, myself, user researcher, a colleague of mine. We had an engineer, and we locked ourselves in this war room for a week. We hypothesized a solution, and then we built this low-fidelity prototype that we went and tested within the building. We didn't have users that we could test with outside of our company, but we could test users within our building. We publicly posted our progress. So within that war room, we put our progress up on the walls, and we brought executives through or anybody who was interested, and we talked through what we were doing. We talked through the walls so that they could experience it more, and people dropped in while we were going out through the week, and they were getting involved with what we were doing as well. We even iterated in that week. We felt like we had validated learnings. We felt like we could solve the problem, and then we presented the solution to that problem. But we didn't really know what our next step was after that. We felt like we had demonstrated the value of this process, and we came up with a solution to the thorny problem. But we found that after that was over, we kind of just were all told to go back to the way we were working before, and we were a little bit confused by that. We had this validated learning, but we weren't the team empowered to be able to do anything with that validated learning. So it left me wondering what did I do? Why was this valuable? The learnings were valuable, but it was the wrong team. We weren't the team that was really tasked or empowered to solve this problem. They gave us this problem to solve, but it wasn't for our product team. And I also found that my day job suffered. I never really got the mandate to do this full time. I was able to do it full time for a week, but trying to balance this lean UX and doing my regular job was difficult, and my day job suffered. And we never did solve the problem of co-location. We found that we still had engineers in other parts of the world that we were working with. We were able to bring everybody to this room for that one day, but in reality, those individuals didn't belong. They didn't live in New York, so we couldn't continue that model moving forward. Well, I left that company and I joined Bloomberg shortly thereafter. And Bloomberg, I found, had a little bit more maturity around the idea of lean UX. In fact, lean UX was being practiced on a team within Bloomberg, the team that's focused on buy-side research and sell-side research, the products that they have on the Bloomberg product for these offerings, for research offerings. Those individuals, those designers, those engineers, they were trying to practice a form of lean UX. I didn't start on that project right away, but I was able to consult with them for a little while, and I asked if I could help out since I was new. I didn't have any project when I first started, so it was an opportunity for me to sort of fill my time and hopefully add some value to what was being done. And so, like any good UX person, I began by doing some research with those individuals. I interviewed the team members, and I found that there were some opportunities. While they were practicing lean UX, they didn't really have a mature understanding of it. So they found that there's validation was difficult. It was difficult for them to get out and talk to users and get user validation. Their wireframes were still heavy. They were heavy deliverables, and they were not the end product. So there were some problems with their design decisions. There were some problems with planning. While the UX team had a deeper understanding of what lean UX was, there was still not being practiced throughout the entire product team. So there were shifting priorities within milestones that made it really challenging for our team to deliver. Feedback wasn't always timely. We would make progress on our designs and almost get to the point where they were being built, but then we would get some feedback which would make us undo. And maybe this sounds familiar to anybody working in UX. And we were finding that because we weren't practicing lean UX the way it was meant to be practiced, that we were being very feature driven. So we weren't stepping back and working toward user goals and problems. We were more reacting to what product managers or product was asking us to build, and it was more about the features and less about what was solving user problems. So we tried a few things. We tried some ways to kind of fix these problems. We started doing some more small batch production. So we designed smaller pieces of work and developed smaller pieces of work so that we could get things moving through our process faster. We did more early and frequent validation, and so we were able to get out and speak to clients externally and internally. So we were validating internally with our product folks. We were being more proactive with getting to our product people so that we wouldn't get late feedback from them. And then we were getting out and speaking to users as much as possible. We started doing more collaborative design. There was some version of Design Studio being practiced, but we tweaked it so that we had more time between developers and designers so that we could have more collaborative design time. We focused on solving user problems, which was manifested in our user stories. And then we made the build our deliverable. So instead of reviewing wireframes every week, as much as possible, we tried to review what had been built. So the designs that we were designing was getting into the build, and we would weekly review those builds with our stakeholders, with our product people, which were our internal clients. And we did a minimum viable design. We did just enough design to get started building, and then we would have more communication between us and the developers instead of doing heavier artifacts. Then it was about that time, after about 6 months of being on that project, something changed within Bloomberg. Bloomberg had always been practicing sort of what I call lowercase agile, where we had some agile methodology, but we weren't doing it formally. So we started rolling out Scrum training to everybody within our engineering organization, and it was offered to us in design. So I was one of the first people to sign up for that Scrum training, and what I learned was that if you know a bit about Scrum, it's a little bit tricky for designers to kind of see where you fit in that process. My first question was, well, what about user experience? What about designers? Scrum is all about product owners, developers, and Scrum masters. So that didn't feel like our role was being represented within Scrum. So when I asked that question, well, where does design fit in? We were told that from the perspective of Scrum, that we were actually developers, which made sense to a degree, but it also didn't sit quite right with me as a designer. And then we also learned that product owners were the ones that prioritized. They were the ones that created and maintained the roadmap, and they were the ones that were meant to interface with users. So that didn't feel right. That didn't feel like, it felt like that was the job of a UX designer, or at least a UX designer would be very involved in those processes. So it felt a little strange when we first started on Scrum. And then further, how does design and development work together within a single sprint? So that was something that was really being pushed on the Scrum methodology, that everything design and development needs to be done within a single sprint, which felt good in some ways, but at the same time, it made us concerned about UX strategy. How do we keep that overall high-level UX strategy? How do we keep consistency between one design deliverable and the next if we're always down in the weeds designing? So what about that high-level consistency? And then what about user research? When do we get to take the time to actually go out and talk to users and do user research, both before and after we design something? But there were some things about Agile that we really loved. Stories were focused on personas, and that's very great. I mean, that's great for UX designers, obviously, and having that sort of institutionalized for us was wonderful. Software is built on prioritizing what the user values. So software was being built on prioritizing those personas. So that's great. That's something that we've always wanted. So again, that was being institutionalized. Then we found out about this concept of spikes within Scrum. A spike can be used for design exploration. It could be used for validation. So that sort of helped us with our how do we get in front of users? How do we validate designs? How do we explore designs before we actually get them nailed down? And then we also really loved the collaboration with developers. We felt that was a very efficient thing to do. It meant lighter deliverables. So that tight collaboration was something on our team that we were already practicing, but again, to have that institutionalized was really great. But we really wanted to make UX work well within Scrum, besides these things, the things that we were concerned about. So how do we do that? So again, a good designer does research first. So we researched internal Agile teams. There were certain teams within Bloomberg that were being touted as example Agile teams, example Scrum teams that everybody should be imitating and getting best practices from. So we went to those individuals and we interviewed what they were doing. We talked to the designers that were working on those teams, and we were trying to understand how it is they're working within Agile. But then we also spoke to some external Agile teams. We found that there were companies that were better at it than us, and we wanted to learn what they were doing and how they were approaching their Scrum. And so we got to speak to people, for example, at IBM, and they came in and spoke to us. And then we looked at the literature. We looked at papers and presentations that would help us with best practices in the industry. One of the biggest ones was the Nielsen Norman Group paper, which I highly recommend, called Agile Development that Incorporates User Experience Practices. It was an excellent paper. It's not free, but I highly recommend using that one. There's a white paper out there that is actually free called Scaling Agile at Spotify. And then there was Josh Seiden's presentation. for lean UX in the enterprise through UIE, which we really enjoyed. And then we brought in Jeff Kelly from IBM and his presentation, adapting Agile techniques to user experience in a non-Agile world. So I highly recommend these resources because we found them very useful in helping us to understand how we fit in to Agile. But we found that when it came to Agile, there were some core reasons why Bloomberg as a company wanted to use Agile methodology. And one of them was to encourage us all to collaborate cross-team, cross-discipline, and cross-time zones. So that was something that we could pick up on and run with. Working software is the deliverable. That was something that Bloomberg wanted us to all do, everybody within our development and design organizations. Seeking out early customer or end user validation of user stories and continuing to iterate was a value that Bloomberg also had, so we liked that. And then the team as a whole and each team member having a willingness to change, which is a core Agile value, but it was also a value at Bloomberg. So these value principles were things that we wanted to make sure that we kept in mind as we were developing the UX process, make sure that we didn't break these principles overall. We also learned that there was different flavors of Scrum being practiced within our company. So there was what we call the religious flavor of Scrum, which is the teams that really practice Scrum by the book as much as possible. And those were interesting that it was happening right here in our company. There was what we call Agile Fall, which is more like the design sprint. So it's still a waterfall process. The design sprint maybe is something that is practiced lean, but that design could get shelved and become basically a waterfall. So that was something we were noticing, that teams were calling themselves Agile, but they weren't really Agile, and we found that was something that really needed to change. We also found that there was what we're calling UX as a service. So there was the individual designer UX as a service. So one UX designer might be servicing multiple Scrum teams, and those multiple Scrum teams would go to that UX designer when they needed design, but then they would go away when they didn't need design, so that one designer was able to service multiple teams. And that is probably the most common model that we find within our company, because we just don't have enough designers to support all the different Scrum teams within our company. But then there were some teams that were also being used as a UX as a service team. So our research team, for example, is small and can't service all the different research projects. So they would engage with an area for a while and then roll off and engage with a different area. So that was more of a UX as a service as a team, and they weren't truly Scrum, but it was something that they had to do. We found that there were some challenges that we were being perceived with. So when people would think of UX, they would think that there was some problems that we cause. For example, when it comes to UX, many felt that UX takes too much time because of our iteration cycles, because of our review cycles, because we discover unknowns during our process, and then the typical time it takes just to do our UX work takes time. So many felt that we were bottlenecks to their processes, and they felt like we slowed down Agile. So that was something that we had to learn to overcome. And then this whole thing about co-located teams, that was something that we weren't going to be able to change. At the time I was working in New York, so the UX team was here in the United States, and our dev team was in the UK. So I can see the UX and dev here is a little off, but so how did we deal with that? We still had to deal with co-located teams, and we found the way to solve that was to get on the phone, to be on meetings every morning together and doing our design studios live. We set aside time for that every day to do that over the phone or over conferencing. So now I want to get into the case study of what we're actually doing, how we actually were able to solve this, and we were able to get our UX designers working within an Agile Scrum framework. The first thing we did was we recommended some changes to the Scrum training. So as this is being rolled out to different UX team members, we wanted them to not experience the first questions that we had. So for example, we recommended that when referring to the customer, that we don't just think about the stakeholder, but we also think about the end user. And so that was something that was put into the Scrum training. We wanted a better definition of what is a developer. We weren't going to be able to change the term developer as UX team members, but we wanted to make sure that our UX designers felt like they were included when they sat through the training. So when we're told that we're developers, that means that we're included, the UX team members are included, software developers, QA testers. So we all had to make sure that, we had to describe that and say, if you're here as a UX designer, you're part of the development team. We also wanted to talk about what the definition of done. So there was this concept of definition of done, but we needed to include UX in that. We needed to include UX examples of definition of done. And then testing was also to include user testing. So there's always quality assurance testing in software, but user testing also needs to be included in that in some way. We also recommended some UX best practices to our UX team. So we recommended this concept of having 2 tracks, discovery and delivery, being done at the same time, and I'll get into that in a bit. We also introduced this idea of staggering sprints. So design needs to still stay ahead of development because they have to have designs to develop, and even if those are light deliverables, it still needs to stay ahead of that. So we introduced this concept of staggering sprints. And then we also talked about how to employ a community of practice so that we can maintain consistency, not only from one sprint to the next, but also between design teams. So there are multiple designers on, for example, the mobile team that I used to work on. How do we maintain design consistency between designers? So 2-track development are basically one team doing both discovery and delivery at the same time. So let me get into that a little bit here. I'm going to break this down for you. So this is meant to be the discovery track. So, think lean UX, think make check is happening over and over again. And as we are engaging with clients and sitting with them and trying to understand them, we're getting validated learnings, because we're not only interviewing them and trying to understand their problems, but we're showing them maybe how we can solve those problems. And once we get to a point where we think, well, this is a way that we can solve this problem through lean UX, we have a validated learning, and those validated learnings get captured. And then there's this idea of a staggered sprint. So the design is happening on the top here, and then the development's happening on the bottom here. So for example, if I'm designing for sprint 2 in sprint 1, the developers are doing foundational work, and they're giving us feedback on what we're designing. We hit the stride sort of in the middle here, so let me just go right to the middle. So in sprint 3, the designer is reviewing what was built in the last sprint, is consulting on what's being currently built by the engineering team, and is designing for the next sprint. While the engineer is building what was designed the last sprint, so they're building the current design as what was designed in the last sprint, and they're consulting on what we're currently designing. So putting it all together here, we have discovery happening on top, where we're talking to users, we're taking those validated learnings, we're refining them through sprint planning, and then they get into our delivery track, and they're being delivered by being designed and then built. So at any one time, a designer can be looking back at what was built, can be designing for what's going to be built in the next sprint, and is consulting on what's currently being built, and possibly even looking further ahead for research on maybe problems that need to be solved in the future. And all this kind of gets put into the product build. Now, sometimes we take shortcuts, which is a good thing, because this can be difficult to do this all at once. So what we found is that sometimes we're very certain about what we're building. We're certain that it has been validated and that it's adding value to the users. So that means that we don't have to research it as much. We'll just go ahead and build it. We can build it if it's not very complex. We can just build it by having a conversation with the developers, and it gets built. But if it's more complex, we might have to do some wireframes. But the point is that sometimes we don't have to go out and validate. Sometimes we don't have to do user research. And then this idea of community of practice. So if you're not familiar with it, this is a very simplified version of what it might look like. So you've got different Scrum teams, and on those Scrum teams, you have visual designers, interaction designers, you have developers. And those developers kind of form teams along the way. Or those designers, for example, might form teams along the way. So an interaction design community is meeting regularly, even though they're not working on the same project, and they're presenting the designs that they're giving to their Scrum teams, so that they can share the work that's being done. Because we might find that someone on Scrum team A is designing something similar to someone on Scrum Team B. And so when those design patterns are being fleshed out, they need to talk and they need to make sure that they're both doing the same thing. And so that's the simple idea of what a community of practice does. There is still a risk involved in staggered sprints, so there is still a slight waterfall. Anytime you're handing off work from one team to another, from one person to another, technically that's still a waterfall. There's also the risk of unplanned work being brought in. So how do we mitigate that risk? Well, for unplanned work, what we found is it's going to happen. In a large company, not everybody's on board with the way we're working, so they're going to kind of push their agenda. There are executives who need stuff done tomorrow or today or yesterday. So how do you mitigate that risk? Well, if it's minor, then it's something that we can just go ahead and do. We'll squeeze it into the sprint and we'll do it. If it's something major, and I should mention that we try to set aside time within our sprints so that unplanned work can be addressed. But if it's major, if it's something that's going to really disrupt our sprint, it's going to put everybody behind, well, then a decision has to be made. But that's something that's transparently made with all parties. And then we prioritize that work with our product manager. Maybe it's something that can be deferred to a future sprint. If so, then great, let's defer it. We have those difficult conversations not only within our team, but we have them with the executives that are requesting that work. And if everyone can agree to defer it to a future sprint, then great, we can do that. But if it can't be done, and it does happen sometimes, we transparently disrupt the current sprint and we work on it, and we are very transparent about what that's going to impact. If it's going to mean that there are going to be delays in delivery, we have to let everybody know and be honest about that up front. But one thing that we're thinking about when it comes to doing everything in one sprint, can we possibly not stagger sprints? There's some advantages to that, because if we can tighten that gap between design and delivery, then we reduce the risk of things changing. We reduce the risk of anything being delayed. This reduces the need for documentation even further. And then it allows user experience designers to contribute in new ways. For example, if all the development or all the design is being done at the beginning of a sprint and then being handed over to the engineers during the sprint, that frees up the UX design team to contribute in other ways. For example, could they be helping with QA, or could they be focusing on future research? Now, this is something we haven't solved yet. Not anyone within our organization is doing everything in one sprint, but we're looking at ways to possibly do that. Can we sit with developers, physically sit with them, and sort of design on the fly? Was one thing that we're thinking about doing. Or do we need to break down our stories even further so that those little pieces of work can be passed over to developers and built? But we haven't solved that yet. So we've got some benefits that we're enjoying because of the way we've been working. So, for example, we have better working relationships between the developers, between products, and between designers. We're all on the same team. So we've really broken down that wall between these different organizations, and we have more team camaraderie than we ever had before, because we're working so closely with our developers, and that's great. And we love it. And also with our product people, we're all kind of facing the same issues, and we're facing them head on together, and we have a stronger, more closely knit team. Because we've taken the time to redo our Scrum training, we find that everybody's speaking the same language. We're all tightly integrated. Because we're working so closely together, we're calling things the same things. So we're calling wireframes instead of mock-ups or whatever. We're all speaking the same language, so there's a lot less confusion between us. We have shared knowledge, which gives us shared ownership. So as we share and work together closely, everybody has ownership over the design. Everybody has ownership over the build. Everyone has ownership over the backlog because we're working so closely together. And that focus on the end user is giving the product more value to the end user. We find that we're building the right stuff because we're thinking more about when we're prioritizing the end user's problems more, thanks to the help of the product managers. So thank you so much. Appreciate very much you taking the time to listen to me. If you want to connect with me offline, here's my email address and my Twitter handle, and I'm happy to connect with anybody. But I think we're going to take some questions now.
Yes, absolutely, Anthony. That was great. We definitely have a lot of questions here to get through.
Okay.
And let me go ahead and clear up a few things here. So, Anthony, I'll invite you into the Slack group as well. But for folks here who are interested in continuing the conversation with some of our speakers, we do have a Slack group. And if you have more than 3 years of work experience inside a product team, we encourage you to apply. We have about 3,500 folks on there right now, including a couple of speakers. And of course, I'll also run this poll here, which I've been doing in every session. And meanwhile, let's go ahead and get into the questions. Yeah, Anthony, you had up to 1,200 people here.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, good turnout. A lot of people were really interested in what you had to say, and also the detail that you provided. So let's dive right in. The first question here is, how are user researchers involved in the Agile process? Because you talked quite a bit about the designers and the developers, but this person is curious how the user researcher works within the Scrum team.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's something that we're thinking a lot about right now. And actually, I'm co-presenting with our user research next week at the local UXPA event. But they're involved in a couple different ways. Sometimes we stop everything and we do user research, and we found that even when we were doing Scrum and Agile with our product managers and cooking along, we found that the product managers saw the value in the little bits of user research that we did, that they were willing to pause and stop and do a user research sprint. So what we do is we engage our user research team. When we engage with them, it's about a 6-week engagement. Doesn't mean that we stop our work for 6 weeks. It means that they come on and we take some time out of every sprint to work with them and think about what it is we want to test. So we'll put those stories within our sprints, like that we need to take the time to. We'll have these spikes basically, where we need to take the time to talk to our user researchers, give them a download of what we're doing, have them help us put together a user research plan, and then we'll take a full sprint where the designers will pause and we'll get involved very much, like fully, into the user research. So maybe one sprint ahead of that, we take the time to build up our what we're going to test. Then the designers all pause and do just user research along with our user research team, and then we get back to our designs while the user researchers go off and do analysis and present their results. So that's how we involve them. That's the heaviest engagement we have with them. We also use them as more like consultants. So we have we work with them to put together a panel of users, and as needed, we will go to those users in the panel, and we are free to do that on our own, or they can help us with that. And that's not as heavy of an engagement. That's just sort of smaller little things where we do more like, I would say, discount usability, where we're just maybe sending out a survey, or we're asking just a few questions of a user because we have these people already pre-vetted and they've agreed to do that. So that's one other thing we do. And then we just sort of consult with them. We do a lot of our own research as designers. So I'll go out and maybe weekly or every other week go out and visit clients. My clients are now internal, so that makes it very easy. But when I was working on external facing things, I would try to get out and visit clients with the salespeople and do my own user research. I might consult with the user researcher if they have time, but a lot of it I would do on my own. Most of us here as designers are qualified to do our own user research, and we do a lot of it on our own.
Gotcha. The next question is very relevant, especially to design and Agile, and that's, one common problem is that UX specs can change often, and they become sort of this moving target for developers. So how do you handle that challenge at Bloomberg? Is there a sort of UX freeze date where a given UX spec is frozen and the developers, develop against it, or how do you maintain that level of flexibility and fluidity?
Yeah, so we don't have a freeze date, but we do have acceptance criteria for our designs. So, and we decide what that is ahead of time. For me, it's typically I'll take my designs, I'll go to the product manager and review them with the product manager, get my feedback, iterate, take those designs, go to the engineers, get buy-in from the engineers, have them look at them more of from a technical aspect, iterate, and then we say that they're done to the point where the engineers can now pick them up and start building. And then I'll move on to the next task. While the engineers are building, they inevitably find edge cases that weren't thought through during the design phase. And we just have conversations at that point. We'll just talk to the engineers. They'll bring up those edge cases. It's not usually something that disrupts anything that we have to go back and redesign, because we've done those checks ahead of time where we've gone to product, we've gone to engineering for the technical validation. So during the build, it's more like conversations. They find that there's an edge case. We'll talk through a solution. We don't even document it. They'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll do quality assurance afterwards. Once it's been built, we'll make sure that everything looks the way we said. So we just kind of do that on the fly. We don't have a lockdown design date, and we're trying to lessen our deliverables as much as possible and having more conversations anyway. So that helps us with that.
Got it. Going back to user research, how far in advance do you plan for user testing and research so that it doesn't impact or slow down a sprint?
Yeah. Again, it depends on the heaviness of the research. So if it's something that, like I talked about, where it's that 6-week engagement, we will kind of get an idea maybe a month ahead of time that we want to do because we have to book a lab and we have to recruit and all that stuff. So it's more like formal user research, and we only do that a couple times a year for our teams. We'll try to about a month ahead of time start thinking. We'll talk to the user research team, say we want to do something, and then about 2 weeks before the actual test is when we're working out. That's when we're more engaged with them and working out the design, the research plan, the script, and so on. So we'll start sort of with who we want to recruit. They'll work on the recruiting, and then So I would say about a month out is where we begin. That's for the heavy research, but because we're doing frequent client visits, and we're not engaging heavily with user research when we're doing that frequently in the discount methods. We only really give ourselves like a week or something like that to think about what we want to talk about the next week or the next sprint.
Right. And some people had a question about this term. So you mentioned a spike, and what does that mean in the context of design within the process?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Truly, in Scrum, all the work that we're supposed to be doing is supposed to be adding value to the build, to the actual software. So, you have to abstract that a bit when you're talking about design, because obviously if we're working on a design, yeah, sure, it does add value to the software, but it doesn't necessarily, our wireframes are not being interacted with by the user. So when I talk about a spike, I'm talking about giving us a spike in Scrum. I should back up. A spike in Scrum, if you don't know, you probably do know, but it allows developers to do research on some technology or whatever. It allows developers to do work that's not directly being put into a build. So for us as designers, we might have to do design explorations, or we might have to do user research. We call that a spike because it's a research effort that's not directly going into a design at that moment that's going to be built, if that makes sense. So that's why we take those design spikes, and we'll do design explorations. We might have to do research on our own design tools or whatever. We use those as a spike.
Gotcha. The next question is about user testing, I think, and that is you mentioned this idea of sort of discount user testing. Mm-hmm. Is that referring to guerrilla user testing or what sort of?
I steer away from the term guerrilla user testing, and yeah, it's probably the same thing to most people. And the reason why I say discount user testing, guerrilla user testing implies that we're doing it maybe kind of outside of the purview of the user research team, or maybe even outside the purview of stakeholders. And we're all about transparency. So when I say discount user testing, I mean similar thing. It's lighter user testing where maybe I'm just having coffee with a user and showing them paper prototypes or just showing paper designs. but it's not formal user testing where I'm talking about that 6-week sort of engagement. So I call it discount because I'm still being transparent about it. Stakeholders are still aware of it. I report on what I'm doing. User research team still aware of it. The user research manager is aware of it. It's not like I'm doing it just, secretly. And that's, to me, guerrilla user testing implies that you're doing it so that maybe you're doing it roguely, I guess. We're not doing that.
Right. And if you're a designer that's working in this UX as a service model,
Mm-hmm.
at what stage in the agile process do you decide if a story is worthy of actually your attention? So at what
Yeah.
point would um, work sort of be moved into the staggered sprint?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So we're still working on that, and we haven't perfected that. A lot of it's just sort of done through tribal knowledge and instinct and gut feeling. But we're trying to formalize it more, where we have what we're calling it like an intake process, where the product manager comes to the user experience team, the UX team, and says, "I have this thing I need to get done." They'll go to the manager of that sort of work area. I have this thing that needs to be done. We say, great, here's this intake form. Detail out what it is that you need done. Then we take that information. We probably have to get more details. And then we estimate that work. And a lot of that, then gets prioritized sort of as that whole piece of work could be a month's worth of work or 6 weeks worth of work. That gets prioritized against all the other work that we're doing on a Kanban, if you're familiar with the Kanban. So it's sort of like we abstract what's going to be done in a Scrum into a Kanban. We prioritize that work. We move that then into the Scrum, and we start working on it. So that's how we've done that, and it's a very common model here for us because like I said, we don't have enough user experience designers. Very few of us have the luxury of being the only designer working with a Scrum team. So it's something that we have to do it that way. We don't have a choice. So I hope that makes sense. So we sort of take the best of Kanban and the best of Scrum, and we manage at a high level the work, prioritize it, move it into Scrum, then we break it down into smaller user stories that can be done within a sprint.
Right. And you mentioned that UX criteria is part of this definition of done. Could you give an example of what that UX criteria might
Sure.
look like?
Yeah. So it depends on the team because every team has to decide on what their own UX criteria is. It could be metrics driven. We don't have a lot of that yet, but it could be metrics driven. But often for me, it means that I've gone through all the steps and I've gotten the approvals that I've needed. So that forces me to be proactive about going and getting that approval. So for me, design is not done until I've gotten approval from the product manager, approval from the tech leads that it's technically feasible, and then I consider it done. That can also mean that later on in a future sprint, I'll go back and validate those with users. But that's tricky to do because you have to be able to close out the story to complete the sprint. So that might be like a future thing we do.
Right. And someone was just curious about the, let's see here. Yeah, about um, how QA works with specifications. So in your process, does the QA team rely heavily on documentation and specifications? And how might there be a way to kind of find that balance between the right level of detail and just getting bogged down in paperwork in the
Yeah,
technical process?
yeah. So what we've found to be best is to involve QA early, um, because they do traditionally rely on our UX deliverables to understand what it is that they're going to test. So they'll use our wireframes when we were building out big wireframe decks. They would use those wireframe decks as their specs, and they would use those to figure out what their what their QA process would be. But what we found is better to get QA into what we're doing earlier. So we try to involve them in our design studios or in our early design conversations and our technical reviews. But then it becomes more on them to gather the information they need and build their scripts out accordingly because there aren't going to be heavy wireframes that they can rely on. So that's how. So it does require a little more work from them to get involved earlier and to document out their scripts um, earlier, as opposed to waiting for the wireframes and doing it once something gets built. And that's how we do it.
Right.
But we don't have a lot of QA here. A lot of the QA is done during the engineering by the engineers, and then we have a very detailed UX consistency process and UX consistency team that will validate what we call the UX checklist, and a lot of that is what QA is. That's a lot of it is the QA that gets done, and they're not traditional QA engineers. They're more like consistency experts, basically.
Right. Um, and this is a sort of a larger question here, which is outside of this agile design process, how do you plan for larger innovation? Is there even room for that? So not just a discovery process before the sprints, but something maybe more complex and wider reaching.
Yeah,
How that works at
yeah.
Bloomberg.
So I wish that we as UX designers were more involved in that, but we aren't as much. It's more done from the product manager level, and they're often having meetings with users and our bigger clients, and that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. Also, a lot of our innovation is driven by government policies. So, for example, um, uh, there's this policy, I think it's called MIFID in the UK or all over Europe. And one of our biggest innovation efforts is coming through the policies of what governments are being required to do, because we find opportunities within those policies to help our users or our clients. Uh, so a lot of it's being driven in that way. We're trying more and more to do more exploratory type user research, but we just don't have as much time to focus on that stuff. So a lot of it's coming through our product teams.
Right. And how do you balance that just the pure workload of designing for the next sprint, consulting on the current sprint, and
Yeah,
reviewing work from the last sprint? Because that
yeah.
seems like it's
It is.
sort of
Yeah. So
a
it's
very
not
long day.
right. So I'll be completely honest, we aren't able to do that in every sprint. So what typically happens is, uh, earlier I showed a slide that had discovery and delivery sort of, running parallel. What typically happens is in one sprint we'll be focused more on discovery, and then in one sprint we'll be focused more on delivery. And that's really the way it's done. And ideally we get everybody sort of focused on discovery and sort of focused on delivery within different sprints. So um, generally we want to think about how we're looking ahead, we're looking back, and we're consulting on the current sprint. But it would be too hard for any one designer to do all that stuff. So typically what happens is, this sprint, I'm going to focus more on, I don't have as much design work. I've gotten a lot of that done. So I'm going to focus more on discovery. This sprint, I just can't do as much discovery. I'm going to have to do more design work. And that's how we do that.
Right. And someone was wondering if you could give a little bit more detail about the size of the teams and sort of the projects you're doing. So that would kind of provide some
Sure.
more
Yeah,
context
sure.
for your solutions. For example, how many people are generally on your Scrum team, and
Mhm.
what are the typical
Okay. Yeah,
classes
yeah.
of the project?
Yeah, sure. So again, one designer is usually supporting multiple Scrum teams. So I'll give myself as an example. Currently, I'm supporting um, more or less 3 Scrum teams. On each one of those Scrum teams, we have about 3 or so. The one part of a designer who is supporting them, about 3 or 4 engineers, full-time engineers on one of those Scrum teams, and then a product manager will often be supporting multiple Scrum teams as well. So part of a product manager as well. And then sometimes we have project managers who are supporting multiple Scrum teams. We don't have as many project managers within our company, but for some of the more high visibility projects, we do. Your typical Scrum stand-up is about maybe 5 or 6 people, which includes product manager, designer, and engineers.
Got it. And the next question here is, do you ever start on a project before the requirements have been defined?
Um, Always. We don't have business analysts and we don't have anybody defining requirements. So we do that through design, and we do that through our research. So we always we always give ourselves time to ramp up on a project when it's something new to us, which gives us time to go and do I guess we do the requirements gathering alongside the product managers, and we do that ahead of time before we start sort of getting into the day-to-day of the scrums.
Got it. Um, and the next question here is about estimation of designer tasks. What does that process look like at Bloomberg?
Yeah, that's another thing that I can honestly say we don't do consistently well. But ideally, we would be sitting down with the engineering teams as they're doing their estimations of their projects. We're doing it with them, and our hope is that they're going to help us because they might view something as easy because it's an easy technical implementation, which is fine. They need to understand the complexity of design. So if you've ever done like planning poker or anything like that, they will sit in with us and they might say, well, that seems easy to design, but then we might be able to educate them on why it isn't. And the more we do that, the better things get. They also we might think something is easy, but they might throw up something that it isn't easy, a high number because of all the technical things that we don't know about, and they're educating us. That's ideal. What often happens is we won't estimate our work. We just kind of think about we will estimate it for ourselves, maybe give it a T-shirt size, and we'll know, based on the complexity of the work, the amount of user research we might need to do ahead of time, things like that. We'll know generally how long it is, but we won't assign it any points because we don't want our points to get mixed in with the engineering points and slow down their velocity. So what often happens is we don't give points to our work, but we do give it a T-shirt size, and we have a general understanding of how much work it's going to take to get through to fill a sprint.
I see. And at the end of the sprint, are your retros done as individual exercises by the teams? So the developers do their own, designers do their own, or is it a joint exercise?
It's a joint exercise. We sit in with the developers and do the retros all together. And sometimes that means we're hearing a lot of things we don't care about, but it's okay because we still should try to understand what the developers are doing. But often it means that we get to contribute to the retros, and we might be hearing things that we need to know about getting our designs done, and what was good about what we did or what wasn't good about what we did. But we're also contributing to, and we can also help them with their estimation and things like that. So it's good for us to all to do the retros together. We're a team, so we want to be doing it together.
Right. And the next question here is, you mentioned that, of course, there are sometimes delays will happen. So how did you communicate those as a good thing so that the team and stakeholders were okay with that?
Well, I don't know that delays are ever a good thing, but what we do is, well, what I do, I can't speak for everyone, but what I do is I will transparently lay out the impact of a delay. So, if I'm being asked to do some work that's going to take me off of the design work that needs to be done, and by doing this work, it's going to make it so that the engineers won't get the design work for the next sprint and they won't be able to start building. I have to have those difficult conversations with the stakeholders in order to have them decide whether it's important enough for us to disrupt everything. And everybody understands, even if it's annoying, everyone understands that taking Anthony off of this and having him focus on this is going to delay all this stuff. And it's important to do that because, for whatever reason, because Mike Bloomberg wants it or whatever, So we have to just have those difficult conversations ahead of time so that it's all about transparency and everybody knowing what we're getting into and what we're agreeing to and how it's going to impact your work.
Right. So going back to judging when a requirement needs design input, how do you sort of make that call when you get a requirement or a user story and you decide, well, this actually does require some design resources versus one that does not?
I don't personally make the call. That's done typically between higher level individuals, whether or not, but we can influence it by doing research. So, for example, any user research we do is uncovering things that need to be solved and future work that needs to be done. so we can influence in that way. But when a design task or when a design request comes to our team, it's on the product managers to tell us why it's important that UX is involved. At Bloomberg, we have I think 3,500 engineers, and I say only because compared to the engineers, only about 50 UX designers. So we only work on the high visibility, high priority stuff, and a lot of the rest of the interface work that gets done, the UX is done because we have these UX checklists, and we have a UX checklist process that our developers are required to go through, but it might never get touched by a UX designer. So um, they have to justify why it is that they are requesting a UX resource, by describing the impact to the user, the business value, the user value. If there's money to be made, basically, by engaging a UX designer, and maybe there's a level of complexity that just really requires us, or maybe it's a new design pattern that we need to think through. So that's how we get involved.
Right. And this is a very common question that comes up in the Agile process, which is, of course, we have all the work broken down into sprints, but how do you ensure that the integrity of the overall concept and the overall strategy remains intact throughout
Yeah.
every single sprint?
Yeah. So on the desktop side, we have we actually took a lot of time to do our design patterns, which is our UX checklist. So we have these very detailed design patterns, and we have to go through a process to break any of them. So we have to ask for exceptions, and those exceptions are not easy to get. So there's that we ensure consistency through design patterns throughout the entire terminal. And then on the mobile side, there's also the design pattern library that we've developed, but we also adhere very closely to human interface guidelines and to the Android version of that. Whenever, I can't remember exactly what it is right now. It's been a while since I worked on Android, but we have to adhere very closely to those that are put out by the manufacturer of the platform. So that's how we maintain design pattern consistency. But then also, remember I talked about the communities of practice. So anything sort of similar. So, like, for example, if I'm working on the research product, which is a product that has a bunch of research results that our clients can access and learn about different companies through research. A related thing would be the news function. So I would work closely as a designer of the research function with the person who's doing the news function, because we're both doing something similar, both providing articles to users. Although there maybe might different types of data and different filters, we're doing something similar. So if I'm inventing something, for example, on how to download a research article, I would want it to be consistent with how it's being done to download a news article. And so we have to meet regularly and talk about what we're designing in case there are things that are similar, and we don't want to reinvent it for each other.
Right. And the next question here is, a few people were curious about the UX checklist that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
How was that created, and what criteria does that include? And maybe you could just explain overall how that's used and kind of
Sure.
enforced.
Yeah. So I'm really proud of this UX checklist. I didn't work on it myself, but it was one of the reasons why I wanted to work at Bloomberg. Bloomberg is a 30-year-old company, and the interface maybe 4 or 5 years ago was inconsistent throughout, because there were so many different teams building their functions on their own without any coordination of what was being done. 7 years ago, we didn't even have UX people in the company, or we didn't have very many. So it was a mess, right? About 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was about 4 years ago, from way up high, the product team way up high realized how important it was to have consistency throughout the entire terminal. So the UX team really paused, and everybody sort of paused making product as much as possible so that we could all focus on creating this UX checklist, which is like a design pattern library. But then it became a checklist that became a requirement for all engineering teams to go through the UX checklist process before they release anything. So we probably took about a year to build out what this checklist would actually be, what the design pattern would be, and we turned that over to engineering. And then we took the time to stop and redo about 80% of the most frequently used functions on the terminal. We took the time to redo those and get them compliant with our UX checklist. So that's why I'm really proud of that, because UX drove a lot of that, and shows how much value they put on UX consistency throughout the terminal. So the UX checklist is a very comprehensive, basically pattern library or design pattern document that is hundreds of pages, and it addresses almost everything that we could face as a designer. And then if there's something new, we add to it as we go along.
So in that sense, the UX checklist is almost like your own design system in a way.
It is our own. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. In fact, we have a function on the terminal that we can access it, but it's only for internal people. It's not obviously for our clients to see.
Interesting. And so this UX checklist, this type of design system, how is that maintained? Is there a certain person or group of people whose job is just to maintain this?
Yeah, so there's a group called the Consistency Group, and they're under the UX department, but they're not UX designers. But their role is to maintain the UX checklist and maintain the UX function, basically all of our design patterns. So whenever we are trying to either invent something new, or if we feel like we need an exception to the process, we go to the consistency team, and they sort of help us work with the product managers either to not allow the exception or to allow it, and we have to explain why.
Interesting.
So we have a team of about, I think they're about, I want to say 10 to 15 people that are maybe I'm wrong, but under UX that are part of the consistency group.
And if they aren't designers, what is their background?
Their background is many of them came out of our help documentation group or technical writing. A lot of them also were customer service people that used to interact with clients and help them when they would struggle with the terminal. So a lot of them are basically either customer service or help people.
I see. And let's see here. All right, so we'll take 2 more questions because we're pushing up on the end of the hour here. Somebody had a really relevant question, I think, to enterprise design, and that was there any moments at which there was some sort of security or intellectual property policy that blocked your ability to test prototypes of new products with end users? And if so, how did you resolve that?
Yeah, so I understand that question well, because when I worked at the last company, we had a lot of compliance reasons why we couldn't talk to our users. So I think I know where that's coming from. At Bloomberg, we don't have that as much. We are pretty free to go and speak to our users because we are not, we're not typically a regulated, like we're regulated, obviously our clients are all regulated, but what we're doing is providing software. We're not, like a trading house, as other places are. To overcome any compliance issues or things like that, while we're free to talk to our clients for the most part, when I worked in that environment, when I worked for a trading house, a trading company, before, the way we got over that is we pre-vetted people we would talk to. So we created a panel of users. It's similar to the panel of users we have at Bloomberg, but we did it for a different reason. The panel of users we had at the last company I worked for were pre-vetted people that we could go to that have gone through all the compliance checks, and we were allowed to speak to them in a very controlled sort of environment. And that's how we got over that. But there are, a lot of rules around, we can't pay the users, what we can say, what we can show, things like that. So, we had to basically follow all the guidelines that compliance laid out for us. And I think one of the most important things when it comes to that is to view your compliance department as partners, not as people trying to block what you're doing, but try to explain to them what it is that you are trying to accomplish in speaking to users, and have them help you get to the users, so that they understand what you're trying to do. They can find creative ways to do that.
Right, right. And this is more of a sort of a big picture question, which is, the Agile Manifesto was written 16 years ago, and technology has changed so much since then. Do you see that Agile is going to eventually go away, or just change into something else?
Well, I mean, I would imagine that the principles of Agile. I mean, they're just I always kind of viewed them as just good common sense. Like, I think about how my parents used to run their restaurant, and they would always get they would get their customer feedback, and it just seems like good business sense to me in most instances. So I don't see it going away. I see it as maybe refining for the new technologies, because of the way maybe engineers work, or things like that. But I don't see it going away because it's just common sense, and it's just a good way to do business.
Right, right. So let's take the last question here, and let's see. All right. So this will be the last question that we take,
Okay.
and that is, within the design organization, which you mentioned is roughly 50 folks or so. Does Bloomberg typically hire more generalists, or looking for specialists that then um, work in one particular area?
We hire, under the UX umbrella, we hire three types of people. We hire interaction designers, who I would say are specialists in interaction design. We hire UX researchers, who are specialists in UX research, and then we hire visual designers. The biggest group, when I say 50, I'm talking about interaction designers. Within the umbrella of UX, the interaction designers are focused on the basically you click and this is what happens kind of thing, interaction design. So I would say they're specialists. We do our own, to a degree, we do our own research, but we don't do our own visual design typically. But we don't have as much need for it because of our pattern library. So we have about, like I said, 50 interaction designers, about 10 to 20 visual designers, and then about 7 or 8 user researchers.
Got it. Anthony, thank you so much for your time here today. This was a great session. We got a lot of positive feedback in the webinar chat. They really liked how practical and rooted in reality everything was, and especially the honesty of it.
It was my pleasure.
And I think it was great. We had over 1,200 people.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a fantastic turnout. And just one last note here, we do have one more session of the day, and that is our next session, which is about user story mapping for practitioners. And it's actually going to be led by Kelly, who is a senior designer at Cineverse. And again, it's going to be a fairly hands-on practical session. So hope to see you guys all there. If you enjoyed this session, you'll probably find that one valuable as well. Hope to see you at the rest of the virtual conference. We're almost done with the first day, and we've got 3 more. So, I'll see you guys in about 20 minutes or so at the next session. And Anthony, thanks, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.